Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Barbara. It's nice to see you, not having to hike. But, and thank you, Bob, and everybody else for coming this evening. I thought tonight, I've been really interested in the Sacred Circles part of Ted's work and just what it represents. And it's an exhibition in the mid-'70s. It's credited with bringing around the idea of native art as art, not ethnography. But I'm really curious about how it did that and why it did that. And I thought tonight I might talk a bit about that. I'm not going to talk much about the pie part of the title. That has to do with Ted's affection for pie. And as he was out collecting, he would drive many miles out of his way for pie. It's legendary how many miles he would drive. So, you know, Ted talked about collecting, and he talked about all the people that he'd met. And this is a great quote from him. Just the inadequacy of our language to describe and understand exactly what his life was about. And I hope tonight to give you a little bit of that understanding of what his life was about and what he thought he was doing during his lifetime. Ted was born in 1929 and he died in 2010. And he was born into a family of art collectors who owned one of the finest collections of impressionistic art. And these paintings surrounded Ted and influenced him from a young age. And he recalled later on that it was a painting by Paul Gauguin of Tahitian women. Yes, it's that single painting that his father owned in the collection that inspired his lifelong pursuits. And he said, "It's clear to me that my interest in the arts of Africa, Oceania, Indonesia, and Indian America stems from this initial dynamic revelation." Now, Ted graduated from Oberlin in 1953 with a BA in art history and continued and received an MA from Yale. Let's see. Yep. There's the home in Cleveland area. And you can see the paintings on the walls and some of the objects on the tables as well, some of the African objects, the mask on the wall between the paintings. Now, while at Yale, Ted developed a reading course with Professor George Kubler that allowed him to read broadly in North American archaeology and art. And Kubler also encouraged Ted to haunt the Julius Kaulbach Gallery in New York City, a great cabinet of curiosities, Ted said, if there ever was one. And then he said, "There my eyes were open to the agonizing beauty of what was then called primitive art." And I'm going to use the term primitive art, and it's all with a lowercase p. And I don't mean any offense by using that term, but it's the term of the era. Now, Ted soon purchased his first piece of primitive art, which was a model of a Haida totem pole, and it cost him $150 in 1955, and that was probably 4 months' rent. And he wrote home a letter apologizing to his parents for spending so much money on that particular pole. Now, in the late 1950s, Ted's reading course would have been considerably lacking, as there were so few publications in indigenous arts. His reading list might have included Renee Howencourt, Franz Boas, Oliver Lafarge, Ruth Bunzel, and Lyle O'Neill, and precious few others. This void would partially be filled 20 years later by his publication of Sacred Circles. Now, beginning in the immediate post-war period, the primitive art market began gravitating towards American Indian arts. And there was a single primitive art dealer in Los Angeles and just a handful in New York City. And North American native arts were included amongst Oceania and African arts. And it was mostly Northwest Coast members, or Inuit, as it was called in Eskimo, but Inuit art as well. And the vast remainder of North American materiality was deemed too ethnographic or too anthropological. Ted grew up within this primitive art market in a home with examples of African and oceanic art displayed near his father's impressionistic art collection, which broadened his understanding of some of the modernist, influence of Impressionism. As Ted matured, he inserted himself into the primitive art field. As an undergraduate at Oberlin, he wrote reviews of some of the seminal books coming out in the 1950s on primitive arts, as well as purchasing this aforementioned Haida sculpture and his first New Ireland piece in Amsterdam in 1953. Now, while curator of European art, which he was at the Nelson Atkins, he busied himself with the non-Western art side of the museum, reorganizing the galleries and acquiring new works. And in 1962, he actually published his first museum catalog, which was The Imagination of Primitive Man, again, while he was serving as curator of European art and sculpture. Moreover, by the mid-1960s, living on an assistant curator salary in Kansas City, the inventory of Ted's personal collection is nearly 100 pieces of Oceania, Africa, and Americas, and the American Indian pieces would later be included in sacred circles. Many he sold to museum supporters, who then donated them back to the museum. Now, upon graduating from Yale, Ted spent 2 years in Washington at the National Gallery, and as I mentioned, in 1959, he arrived at the Nelson Atkins as the assistant curator of European paintings and sculpture. He was appointed assistant director in 1965 and director in 1977. And at the time, the Nelson Gallery was a small provincial museum with a rather standard, unexceptional collection of world art. But during his Kansas City years, 22 years in all, Ted was repeatedly able to use the museum's exhibitions and acquisitions programs to bring new and challenging ideas to his board and audience, shaping much of the museum's future growth and development. Upon his departure in 1982, his collection not only was world-class, but the museum had taken extraordinary risks in diverging from Roman antiquities, medieval arts, and European painting to collect and exhibit contemporary and cultural arts. Leading up to the Sacred Circles exhibition had been a succession of increasingly important showings of non-Western art, important showings of non-Western art, African sculpture, and the remodeling of what was then called the primitive art halls. Active in both the museum and art worlds, his correspondence files are filled with inquiries and offers of sale from galleries, from artists whom he knew personally and visited on his frequent trips to New York and Europe. Ted worked fluidly between collecting, dealing, curating, and raising funds. He saw no differentiation between them. Unfortunately, no boundaries could also be messy. At times, Ted's work would be uneven and incomplete. He might take at face value documentation, but eventually he learned to ignore documentation and just trust what he saw in a piece. Although hired as a curator of this European art, Ted also took an active interest in modern art. Within his first year, organizing exhibitions and suggesting new acquisitions. And while there's no record of Ted's consciousness being raised in the 1960s, the shows that did dominate the 1960s showed non-traditional, alternative, and highly American art, perhaps did alter his view by connecting emotion, community, and experience with art appreciation. And these are the elements that he would later in life so much appreciate about native art. Now, over the past decade, as Ted's friends, and this is the present past decade, over the past decade, as Ted's friends and donors have matured, the Nelson Atkins has been the beneficiary of major gifts, the best modern art collections, the best impressionistic collection in the United States, and a fantastic gallery of native arts. And Ted is widely credited for those additions. Now, Sacred Circles, 2,000 years. Ooh, I missed one. There we go. Sacred Circles, 2,000 Years in North American Indian Art, opened in 1976 at the Hayward Gallery in London, and the following year at the Nelson Gallery. It was a virtuoso museological and research performance. Ted scoured private and public collections to select from the finest, most singular examples of native art available, and along with organizing and orchestrating the exhibit, all by mail, by the way, slow mail, not email, not electronic mail, no fax machine, an occasional phone call, but a mountain of letters. He arranged for 90 loans, and including American loans, to travel to London, and basically made it impossible for us to assemble the same show again, because by having the Sacred Circle show, nobody would send all those same objects out again, let alone to one venue. So he changed our world in many ways, and this is what he said about the exhibition. This is Ted. Americans and Canadians, having turned their eyes from Europe and Africa to look inward at their own continent, are finding that the art of the Indian world, for so long geographically coexistent with their own, is of a universal quality when at its best. Perhaps we are still a little shocked as having to admit what fine sculptors, designers, and craftsmen Native American artists were and are. In the last years, all of these objects, once considered homespun and only marginally local interest, have begun to be collected as avidly as any other art. Now, when the exhibition opened in Kansas City, which was the only American venue, in April 1977, it filled the entire main floor of the museum. And there were over 700 objects. Again, not all the loans would come to the United States, so we had to negotiate new loans, so there were now 101 loans instead of 90 loans. And 350,000 people in 9 weeks saw Sacred Circles in Kansas City, and 75,000 catalogs were sold. In comparison, in London, 2,500 people a day saw the exhibition, and there were 20,000 catalogs sold. So if you think it's influential, I think that's certainly one of the reasons. I've never met anyone that had anything negative to say about the exhibition, which in our field is an amazing accomplishment all on its own. Now, Native peoples, artists, and performers traveled to Kansas City to celebrate manifold Native culture and arts. In addition, a generation of Native art scholars, dealers, and collectors refer to Sacred Circles as a touchstone or watershed in their careers. My friend Jack Rushing of University of Oklahoma said, "I was so excited by the exhibition, I took a week off from work and every day from opening to closing sat in the exhibition galleries, returning to my hotel room each night to reread the catalog. And during the next 35 years, it would also be the defining experience in Ted's life as well." This is Maria Martinez, the famous potter, along with her son in the red blanket around his neck, talking with Ted. Now, as the field of anthropology left behind museums and collections beginning in the second decade of the 20th century, thousands of specimens, artifacts, and objects from throughout North America languished in museums, unseen and unused. But then during the 1960s and 70s, there appeared a rising interest in American Indians that one could directly tie to civil rights, beatniks, hippies, and the environmental movement. I must have left something out there, but it's something like that. Whereas interest was once tied to the closing of the American West and Manifest Destiny accomplished, these same collections were now perceived and elevated to art and the people who made them as artists rather than simple craftspeople. Parenthetically, this was also an important era for Native peoples asserting their rights about those collections and beginning to request the return of collections. But how did this transformation happen? Certainly the objects themselves did not change. Nothing magical happened to them. It is merely our perception of the objects, acknowledging the cultures and traditions and histories of American Indian peoples. Nor was Ted the first to try and create art from ethnography. There had been attempts throughout the 20th century to move this native materiality from ethnography to art. Examples include the 1931 exposition of Indian tribal arts in New York City and the 1941 exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And both of these were publicized as exhibitions, not ethnography, but art, and nonetheless, these exhibitions were not able to live up to their supposed purpose. There wasn't the context, the national context to do so. Moreover, images of the exhibitions do not appear so different from anthropological exhibitions. The objects are divided into culture areas by material or technology and or tribe. And gone were the cases of hunting, religion, women's work, and so forth. But culture and culture areas continue to be the defining way that things were divided and understood. None of these would have that lasting effect, as I said, because the national context was not correct or not in the right place to accept Native people and to accept their arts or materiality in the way that Ted hoped to do so through Sacred Circles. Now, the shift in attitude towards Indian art, a result of a broader international context, that created a resurgence of interest, as I've mentioned, and resulting in books, movies, and a new market for Indian-made objects. Native art history became an academic discipline in the 1970s. As Indian art scholar Ted Coe recalls, the art had always been there. It was only a matter of calling attention to it. And Ted possessed a very important seat at the table as this new field of Native arts was created. Now, in the 1960s, many discovered the religions of American Indians and interpret them in terms of a highly ecological consciousness. Movies such as Little Big Man, my favorite, security-inspired sage image, while books like Black Elk Speaks, Lame Deer Seeker Visions, and Rolling Thunder sent native and non-native people off on vision quest. Perhaps the pinnacle of this is epitomized by searching Indian Sacred on Amazon and finding 6,654 entries for that, all published post-1970. And that's not mixing up with the other Indians. This is just Indians, North America. Now, in response to the heightened interest in Native collections of art, exhibitions were organized beginning in the same period of time, other exhibitions were also organized. And it's interesting, from the 1970s period, people just remember sacred circles. Does anybody remember one of the other titles, besides Barbara, one of the other titles from that time period? It's very hard to do so, but there were 4 other successful exhibitions, starting with an exhibition at the Met. There was one at the Walker Art Museum, National Gallery of Art, and someplace else, Chicago Art Institute, Evan Mauer's 1979 exhibition. But none of them had the impact of sacred circles. And certainly the numbers of people who saw the exhibition had something to do with that. Now, anthropological collections, valued for their capacity to represent indigenous lives, began to be seen as a universal heritage as art, and began to be recontextualized again. Providing a non-native modern context for Indian arts was not a new concept, but all these efforts, as I said, had little or long-lasting national impact, because they were more concerned with the anonymous, primitive, and tribal art than they were of individual artists' works. Now, these exhibits may have included superb pieces of modern art. However, they were generally displayed, as I mentioned, by tribe or technique. I'm talking about the 1970s exhibits now, include a wide variety of dates and media. In contrast, contemporary Anglo art, non-native artist exhibitions usually presented a single artistic genre and represented a single period of art history. In addition, Indian art exhibitions, such as the 31 show in New York and the 39 show in San Francisco, included demonstrations by artists and other cultural performances like dance and so forth. Now, Anglo artists or white artists are never asked to demonstrate and or dance or sing and their openings. So again, the differentiation between the different worlds, it's not an equal world. Now, Sacred Circles was not set up any differently than these other expositions. And Sacred Circles included a large variety of media from a large geographical area, all of North America, and arranged by geography, just by culture area, and a general and hazy date of pre-1900. And that pre-1900 translates to more authentic. But claiming everything as art, in fact, may diminish Native culture and art by reducing it to one overly simplistic category, art. To simply elevate everything to art because we want people to think better of one another is a theoretical morass, and with the naming of Native art came increased romanticism and separation of actual Native materiality into traditional and non-traditional, traditional contemporary categories we're struggling with today. And any such discussion of traditional and non-traditional, in my mind, is just a dead end. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't understand who Native people are. And most importantly, deadening to this just making everything into art is deadening to the sentience and histories and cultures of indigenous peoples of the Americas. Importantly, calling everything art casts off any intellect and cultural processes that go into the making of things, and just is another theory that we throw on to people rather than allowing people to speak for themselves. Art is about achievement and singularity, and sometimes when we see great art, we might audibly gasp at its beauty or its perfection at capturing a memory and or emotion. And generally speaking, materiality may be beautiful and unnecessarily too decorative for its own good, but every culture has a mundane and ordinary that's part of our daily and ceremonial lives. And I'm not for a moment denying that in Native cultures there is great art. Now, in addition, what right do we have to another culture's materiality, art? Art, like everything else, is based in culture, and to understand what is and what is not art requires an understanding of a culture and its perceptions, its own perceptions of beauty and specialist. I have no doubt, again, that there's great art in these communities, but we need to listen to the communities and let them talk for themselves. Sacred Circles ignored contemporary-made objects as well. The exhibition only included historic objects, the dates for the works being no later than 1900. 1900 is a magic date in Native arts. It's the date in which tradition stopped for some reason. It's a great dividing point. But in museums and collecting alike, if something was made in 1910, it's too recent, but if something's in 1899, it's just right. Now, Sacred Circles ignored, as I mentioned, let's see, the using over 700 objects for the exhibition also diminished the art quality of Sacred Circles. Large quantities of objects screams ethnography and ancient. Consider how museums handle the numbers of objects on exhibitions by calling large numbers, calling exhibitions with large numbers in them study collections, open storage, and then think about where you see large numbers of objects in art museums, and we see them in collections of ancient cultures, ancient societies, civilizations, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Rome, Greece, and so forth. Therefore, by displaying so many objects together in London and Kansas, Ted, I believe unwittingly, reproduced an exhibition that screamed ancient in the past. Indians made great art a long time ago. In this way, Sacred Circles sealed Indian people in the past rather than helping visitors appreciate them in the present. The past in American Indian peoples is synonymous with authentic, as I've mentioned, which is the reason anthropology for so long wrote about indigenous people in the past present. The use of so many objects in the geographical layout of the exhibition suggested to visitors the past, in turn the exclusive use of historic objects coupled with the exhibition title further suggested an ancient, unobtainable, no longer obtainable way of life. And everybody acknowledged that Indian people were alive, but most believed that Indian people had changed and that they had left their true culture behind because they had changed. They had become what we say in anthropology as acculturated. Now, using the word sacred in the title, I also have an issue with, no surprise. And it was no help in diminishing the idea of old attitudes and the idea that Native people were something of the past. Succinctly, sacred says authentic. Unfortunately, sacred is also associated with the other and something we find elsewhere, often amongst tribal peoples in places like Tibet, Machu Picchu, Pueblo dances, Sankoe. And it's a special time, a place removed from the ordinary. People come away from Pueblo dances with an elevated consciousness. Sacred is not something we experience every day. You know, and sacred also in our Western society suggests antiquity, a simpler time of existence. You know, we're socialized away from having sacredness in our day-to-day. We often have to learn something about that. People go away to learn those things again. And it has to do then, if you could strip away social life, a higher culture, if you will, that we could then find the sacred again. So that's how the title then, Sacred Circles, told people this was about not only a different type of people, but also then about an earlier epoch in their lives before they were acculturated or changed onto reservations into American life. And then also, Ted, as a museum curator and director, behaved more like a collector. I don't know if that makes sense. It makes perfect sense to me. And what I mean by that, he treasured the religious object or ceremonial object over the everyday object. And he thought that these objects had deeper values, more easily presented Native cultures, and as everything around Native cultures was changing and evolving in a natural state, that these religious objects held tight to a certain type of value. They were unchanged. So by having sacred circles and having the notion that everything was sacred or religious would suggest to people everything in the exhibition was authentic and more or less unchanged. Now, following the success of Sacred Circles in London and the overall achievements of his 20 years at the museum, Ted was appointed director in 1977. However, in the 5 years following the Kansas City showing of Sacred Circles, Ted perhaps unknowingly moved inextricably from his position as director to one increasingly of curator and collector. not unlike a 19th century British explorer. He increasingly ignored his director position, resulting in his forced resignation in 1982. And over the next year, he served as a senior scholar at the National American Art Archives at Smithsonian in Washington. Again, he was offered a position. He turned that position down again. And after finishing his year in Washington, he realized that he couldn't go home to Kansas City. And so where else would he move but Santa Fe, New Mexico? And Ted would never again hold a steady job, but make his living, quite honestly, selling some of those paintings from his family's collections, and then also serving as a private collector and curator for people. I want to talk now about the exhibition he did as a follow-up, Lost and Found Traditions. Lost and Found Traditions, Native American Art, 1965 to 1985. The exhibition was funded on a dream. Ted went to the American Can Company and told him he wanted to go around the United States and Canada and collect from living traditional people. And when they give him some money, and they gave Ted, with not one object collected, just the idea on the basis of sacred circles, they gave Ted $100,000 in 1978 to collect for Lost and Found Traditions. Ted collected 800 objects for Lost and Found Tradition, all newly made objects. He went around the country and met people, both artists directly. He met people, traders and anthropologists, and just a trail that he left. He drove tens of thousands of miles collecting for it. He collected between 1977 and the exhibit opened in 1986. Ted also had the habit of buying two of everything. And so when he bought one for the exhibition, he'd buy one for Ted. And the other thing that Ted did, a little bit unkosher these days, was came into the end and they needed to pay him for his expenses like gas and hotels and so forth. So Ted, being the collector, took objects instead of the money. So one thing after another for Ted like that. Now, some would criticize this Lost and Found Traditions for its apparent antiquated view of Indians through its emphasis on traditional rather than contemporary and modern. But Ted persisted in wanting to demonstrate that Native people could be contemporary and be traditional and still practice tradition in the modern day. And although there have been a number of exhibitions treating American art from an historical viewpoint, Lost and Found Traditions at that point in 1986 would be unique because of its emphasis on community, the vigor of communities, the expansion and adaptation of living traditions and Native art to current circumstances. And this is what Ted said about his Lost and Found experience. I had the time of my life in Indian country. I was lucky to have been knee-deep in Indians, as my closest Indian family friend explained to someone who wondered where I was. I attended numerous powwows, potlatches, feasts, and doings on the Northwest Coast, excuse me, and Plains Indian celebrations, witnessed tribal councils and society meetings, met fascinating elders and wise tribal dignitaries. Now, as I mentioned, as a result of Lost and Found Traditions, Ted became a prolific collector, discovering that there were more affordable ways to broaden the collection beyond choosing just historic or expensive pieces. The market tends to differentiate between contemporary and the historic tends to be more expensive than the contemporary, which perhaps I should have used as evidence for how the marketplace also emphasizes the older as more authentic. But I didn't think of that till just now, so sorry. So I appreciate the input. That's really good, it's important. Now, Lost and Found Traditions was prescient. It foreground developments in the Native art world. However, by its closing 8 years later, the concept that there were living and active Native peoples was tired, and a story of survival and perseverance was better told by Native peoples themselves. As interest in Native arts grew in the 60s and 70s, people sought out artists, and buying, this is the reason why this happened, and buying directly from artists or from galleries where artists attended openings or exclusively showed their work also was considered buying from artists. This became the authenticity of the era. So the 60s and 70s was about buying directly from people, having that experience, that experience. So when Ted started out on the journey of Lost and Found, that wasn't as much present, but soon it became to be the experience for everyone. Collecting for Lost and Found Traditions exhibit was in many ways a revelation for Ted. He knew of the presence of living people, and certainly the pretext of the exhibition was that there were numerous traditional arts still alive in practice. In a matter of thinking, Ted was the one that was lost. And each time he found another artist, another foundation stone in the fortress of Native arts that he was building, that he was found. And Native people were, of course, neither lost nor did they need finding, but through the exhibition, Ted brought to light for the vast majority of the public the very fact that Native people were alive and still were practicing their traditional cultures. And I wonder if Ted's convictions to curate this exhibition would have occurred without the 9 weeks of continual demonstrations that marked the Sacred Circles exhibition in Kansas City. Now, following its travel, the Lost and Found Traditions collections were offered to museums, and people had to send in applications for the collections, and they ended up with the Los Angeles County Museum of Natural History of nearly 800 pieces. In addition, during the collecting phase, I also mentioned that Ted built a considerable collection from many of the same artists. It was always easier for him to purchase the two. And Ted also spent the next 20 years of his life, from 1994 onward, pretty much retracing his steps, returning to craftspeople and traders from whom he had purchased objects, having that same piece of favorite pie wherever he went, driving literally tens of thousands of miles, wearing out several different automobiles at the same time. Now, during these years, there was no more important of a person than Joyce Growing Thunder Fogarty. Joyce is an Assiniboine individual from Rocky Boy up in Montana. They met in Jackson Hole in 1983, and Ted was wandering through the galleries and trading posts looking for objects to purchase and leads to follow for Lost and Found Traditions. And Joyce was wandering through galleries and trading posts looking for people to buy her artwork. And I'm sure they crossed paths many times that day, and as Joyce describes it, finally in the street, she said, "Who are you?" And they became lifelong friends, and Ted was adopted into the family in a native way, became a relative that way, and traveled with the family a great deal. He describes shaving in gas stations, and his niece, who runs the foundation now, has taken that role in the family with Joyce and her family. It's a very talented family. Ted provided for Joyce a foothold in the American art world. Ted understood the art world, but he also understood Joyce as a master artist, yes, someone that had been relegated to a separate but not equal category of American art. In Joyce, Ted saw her vision and her technical skills to bring her vision to life. And as Ted grew closer to the Growing Thunder family, as he began to travel with them, he saw how extraordinary her work was as compared to others. And he began to promote her work, and he began to talk about her work and got her into Indian Market in Santa Fe. She won 2 years in a row, hands down. She stopped entering for a while. The next time she entered in 1992, she won again. She didn't enter again until 2011, and she won that year as well. So it just is the type of artist she is. There's many people that do beadwork, but how do you elevate someone who does such an extraordinary job in the beadwork? And that's what he was really interested in with Joyce. Now, by 2000, when Ted began the work of preparing for his final exhibition, called The Responsive Eye, Ralph T. Coe and the Collecting of American Indian Art for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, he had coached his eye and mind to simultaneously see an object from the point of view of finding art, the objects, so looking at the thing, looking at the art, but then because of his experience with Lost and Found Traditions, he also then understood the people side. So his eye, the idea of the responsive eye title is that your eye bounces between people and object. And by bouncing between people and object, you'd have a more accurate understanding and view of the piece itself. Ted was very disappointed with this exhibition. It fell very flat, and he withdrew actually his intended gift of his entire collection and funds to the Met. because of the exhibition. There was a lot of bickering over what was art and what was not art. I think in retrospect, I'm not sure what the Met would have done with this 2,000 objects. He did end up giving 200 objects to found the department and service the foundation for a new Native Arts department. He felt very strongly that there should be, in the world arts, a consideration of Native arts, and we're still waiting for that to happen at the Met. They still have not fully recognized Native arts, but we hope they're on the way. Now, this is his house, if you can believe it. Just a few little things. In the end, Ted saw not art, but people's experiential existence in their world. He understood the continuity of form and that the past and present are powerfully bound. The formula was simple. By displaying art, he was making people know, and by working with artists, he was making art known. One is connected to the other without hesitation or gaps, a long, continuous looping ribbon. And by finding and identifying the makers of traditional art, he was able to put people first, as well as to see their art within the broad context of culture and landscape, rather than on a pedestal in a museum. The art of a particular society is best understood in relation to its place within that society where it was produced, rather than in relation to how members of another society might understand it. It is only in this way that Ted could comprehend what he was looking at. Experiencing, perhaps, is a more apt word to describe Ted's methodology. Now, whether sitting in front of an object, driving miles out of the way to find an artist, rummaging around antique in tribal arts galleries, or researching in the storerooms of the world's great museums, he learned by doing and experiencing rather than simple study. Beginning in the late 1970s and only concluding with the deterioration of his health, he immersed himself in traveling thousands of miles each year to meet Native American artists, engaged in their cultural activities, visiting the communities, endless cups of coffee, and reigniting the friendships that fed his passion for art. He was an accumulator, in the end, of people and experiences, as well as the mounds of paper for his planning and the receipts from his trips. It'd be difficult to determine just how many miles he drove, but he drove an awful lot of miles. It was on this quest to meet and visit artists and craftspeople that he shared his other passion, a good piece of pie for which he would drive miles out of his way. Coe befriended Native artists, and he said, during the years I assembled my collections, I camped, attended feasts, ceremonies, and often just shared endless cups of coffee with Native people throughout the United States and large stretches of Canada. Now, during his lifetime, this is another view of his house, just the other end of the room. During his lifetime, Ted personally purchased several thousand pieces for museums and private collectors, and as well as his own personal collection. He was never a wealthy man, and mostly purchased his works on time, which meant beginning of each month, he ran around Santa Fe to all the galleries and gave them small checks and hoped they wouldn't bounce back to him. He was eclectic in his tastes as well, and he bought Oceanic, African, and Indonesian, Asian, and Native arts until his passing. Now, visiting Ted's home, as you can imagine, that's a good view of it, isn't it? Visiting Ted's home was really a matchless experience. Every nook and cranny of the house was covered with his acquisitions, and he was conversant in every art form, from the smallest and rarest of tribal items to the European and American paintings that adorn the walls in the living room. He arranged his collections by how the pieces looked together or associations among them, baskets stacked in corners, model boats in the laundry room, and special cabinets filled with treasures. He long desired to add a Chilkat robe to his collections, and once he did, he hung it in his bedroom so he could look at it every morning. Ted's vision is now the Ralph T. Coe Foundation for the Arts in Santa Fe, and he provided the foundation with the core of 2,000 objects and a mission to continue his life's work of appreciation of Native arts and culture. The nascent foundation is beginning our journey, one marked so well by Ted's own journey. And part of it is using these 2,000 objects and getting them out into people's hands. We don't have a strict glove treatment on everything, but we're working with kids and other community members and having them look at the objects first and handle the objects first in order to ignite their senses. By just looking is one way of understanding, but like Ted's idea of experiencing, if we can get people to handle the things and begin to just get the feel and smell of things and so forth, we think it'll really change people. Now, Ted also, he was a consummate curator, collector, and connoisseur, and Ted possessed a dedication to looking and finally to seeing, a process of absorbing and understanding. And he said about his life, "All my life, I relied on this measured process of aesthetic absorption and understanding. All my life, all my life, I relied on this measured process of aesthetic absorption, whether the work is a Renaissance plaque or a Native American wearing blanket. It involves returning over and over again to the individual work of art. I revisit and bear constantly in mind the objects of my own collection, however large or small, to gain new insights. They are not trophies, but instruments of passion with the power to unexpectedly reveal mysteries." Thank you very much.